Okay, what we're going to be talking about now is gear checks. Why do we do gear checks? The reason we do gear checks is to make sure all of our equipment is in proper working order before each and every single jump. We just don't do gear checks at the beginning of the day, but we do them before each and every jump, not only to our own equipment, but to other skydivers' equipment. There's an acronym that we use in skydiving, and it's called SHAGR, and it basically has to do with your equipment, your personal equipment. Make sure your shoes are tied, make sure your laces are tucked in, make sure you have a helmet, you have an altimeter, you have your goggles, gloves, you've gone over your aerial, which has to do with your landing pattern, and last but not least, your radio. Also in skydiving, on our gear checks, we have what's called rules of three. On our rig, we have a 3-ring system, and it's basically that's what holds our parachute to our rig. We want to make sure those are lined up correctly and attached correctly and assembled correctly. We also have 3 straps. Those 3 straps are our 2 leg straps and our chest strap that hold us inside the rig. Third thing is our 3 handles. We have a emergency cutaway handle, we also have a reserve handle, and last but not least, our activation handle, which is basically our pilot chute. And the last thing we have on our rig that we need to think about is the 3 pins. We want to make sure those pins are seated correctly so we don't have a premature deployment before we want a deployment. And the third pin is basically what's considered our automatic activation device. And that is what would help save us if for some reason we couldn't get our parachute open. Okay, before we talk about any gear checks on the actual rig itself, let's talk about our personal equipment. The first thing we want to make sure is make sure our shoes are tied, laces tucked in, make sure there's nothing that's going to catch as we're leaving the plane. Next thing we want to make sure we have is a approved helmet, safety helmet. Next thing we want to make sure we have is an altimeter. Also, we want to make sure we have gloves, goggles, protect our eyes. Before we get in the plane, we also want to make sure we've gone over our aerial with our instructor so we know our landing pattern. And last but not least, we're going to have a radio on us. It's either going to be on our chest strap or attached to the side of our helmet. Next, we're going to go over the things on the rig. First thing we're going to talk about on our gear checks is our 3-ring system. The 3 rings basically bear the brunt of the load that holds your parachute to your actual rig. When we're checking these, we want to make sure that each ring only goes to the next ring one time only. We also want to make sure that our closing loop goes down to the very top one. Bill's got this exaggerated just a little bit. We got it loosened up a little bit so you can see on the back. We want to make sure that closing loop goes through the housing here, and then we want to make sure that our cutaway thread goes all the way down through the closing loop. And if it's done that way correctly, then you know that that riser is good. You also want to do the same thing on the other side. Basically, I'm going to check my 3 rings again, 1, 2, and 3. My closing loop goes down to the top one. I would turn it over and I would look and make sure it goes down to the grommet housing and then back down with the cutaway handle. But basically, if you check those 3 things, you know your 3 rings are good. Okay, the next thing we want to make sure that's hooked up on our 3-ring system is our RSL. It's called a reserve static line. What this does is if you have to have a cutaway, this helps get the deployment going of your reserve chute a lot faster. We want to make sure before we get in the plane that that is attached like it's supposed to be and the pin is all the way through. Next thing we're going to talk about on our rig are the 3 straps that actually hold you into the rig. First thing we're going to look at, the first 2, are the leg straps. We want to make sure that our leg straps aren't twisted in any manner. We want to make sure that our webbing is routed correctly. We want to make sure it comes over and then down through the loop so the gravity or the tension will hold that in place. You want to take your extra webbing, make sure it is tucked in and out of the way and it's not flapping around while you're in free fall. And again, you want to make sure on each side that you don't have any twist. Also, there's going to be a different type of what's called clips. You may have a rig that has clips. You also just want to make sure before you clip those in that they're not twisted. Again, if everything is routed correctly, we can move on to our chest strap. Chest strap is what basically will hold you into the rig also. We want to make sure it is routed correctly. We want it tight, but not too tight. We want to be able to arch and free fall. We want to make sure it is routed around this buckle and then down through. Again, so that tension will keep that buckle in place. If it's looped over, it is going to open up on you in free fall. So always make sure this is routed correctly, and when you're checking someone else's rig, make sure that is routed correctly. The last thing we want to make sure we do after we've checked the routing on everything and make sure there's no twist is basically give everything a good yank. Make sure everything's tight and it's not going to come apart in free fall. That way, it may not always be comfortable with the person you're checking, but at least we know they're not going to come out of the rig. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is the 3 handles on the rig. Bill's going to turn around for me. First one we're going to look at is our main deployment handle. We want to make sure that when we're checking this, to make sure there's nothing extra hanging out like this. If there is, we want to make sure that's shoved in there. The only thing that's coming out is the hacky sack right there. We want to make sure it's not pushed in there where the person can't find it. That would be a bad thing in free fall. Just make sure that that is seated correctly, and then we can move around to our handles in the front. One thing we want to check, I'm going to move around Bill here real quick. First one is our cutaway handle. We want to make sure it's seated in the webbing correctly, make sure it's not flapping loose, make sure it's not turned in like that. That'd be awful hard to find if you needed to find it. Just make sure that is seated correctly up to the housing. The next thing we would do is go over here and check our reserve handle. Want to make sure it's seated correctly, not flapping around the wind. We want to check for movement here on the cable, make sure it slides correctly. And that way, if it ever had to be used, it could be pulled out very quickly. And that's these 2 handles what you would use during your emergency procedures. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is our 3 pins. The first one, it's not technically a pin, but it's our automatic activation device. Some are just inside the reserve and some are on the back side. The easiest way to check that on someone when it's on the back side is have them sit down just a little bit. You can lift up, you can look, you can see that the AED is on, so we can move on now to our main deployment pin. What we want to do is come up here, make sure we don't have any bridle out or anything like that. We want to make sure our pin is seated correctly, seated all the way down into the closing loop. And we want to make sure that's tucked up under there. Some people on the rigs, on their line here, will have color on it. Some won't. You always ask the skydiver who you're checking, do you have color? And if they tell you blue, red, black, whatever, you check it and make sure they have color. That way we know our pilot chute is cocked. Next thing we're going to move on to is the reserve pin. This pin right here, we need to make sure it's seated, make sure that there's no fraying or anything like that. The rigger seal, basically, make sure that that is still intact. That way we know it hasn't been messed with. Make sure it's routed correctly through the RSL, and make sure it goes back up into the rig like it's supposed to. The last thing we want to talk about in gear checks is basically that there should be 3 times your gear is checked before you ever exit the plane. The first time is when you're checking your own equipment, making sure everything is routed correctly like it's supposed to be, make sure everything is in working order. The next time is either when you're checking someone else's gear or someone is checking yours. And the third time is before you actually exit the aircraft. You make sure everything is in working order, and that way you're going to ensure that at least your equipment is in working order before you get out of the plane.